Let me be direct with you from the outset because what is unfolding in Pakistan's tribal areas right now demands directness. Everyone is focused on Islamabad. Everyone is watching the politicians, the generals, the IMF negotiations. But that is not the real story. The real story is being written in the mountains of Waziristan, in the valleys of Kurram, in the borderlands that most people cannot even locate on a map. What we are witnessing is not a counterterrorism operation. It is not a law enforcement exercise. What we are witnessing is the quiet dismantling of the Pakistani state's authority in its own territory, and the consequences will reshape South Asian geopolitics for the next 2 decades. I am looking at intelligence reports that have been circulating among regional security analysts for the past 96 hours, and I need you to walk through this with me because what these reports show is not a surge in militant activity. It is not a temporary uptick in violence. It is not seasonal fighting patterns. What these reports show is a coordinated, multi-actor campaign to establish parallel governance structures in areas that, on paper, belong to Pakistan. And the timing, the coordination, the sophistication of this campaign tells us something that should alarm anyone paying attention to the stability of nuclear-armed states. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why Pakistan is losing control of its tribal belt, why this matters far more than the Kashmir dispute that dominates headlines, and why the ripple effects of what is happening in these mountains will determine whether Pakistan survives as a unified state beyond 2030. This analysis is based on field reports, satellite imagery analysis, and direct testimony from tribal elders that most Western media will never access. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively monitored by intelligence agencies in Washington, Beijing, and New Delhi, and you are not getting this level of analysis from mainstream sources. Let's start with geography, because most people fundamentally misunderstand what Pakistan's tribal areas actually are. The region we are discussing comprises approximately 27,220 square kilometers along Pakistan's western border with Afghanistan. This is not empty desert. This is not barren wasteland. This is mountainous terrain with an estimated population of 5 million people, organized into tribal confederations that predate the Pakistani state by centuries. The Federally Administered Tribal Areas, or FATA, were merged into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province in 2018, but that administrative change on paper has done almost nothing to change the reality on the ground. To put this in perspective, these tribal areas are larger than the entire nation of Rwanda. The terrain is some of the most difficult on Earth for conventional military operations, with elevation changes of over 3,000 meters, narrow mountain passes, and valleys that can only be accessed on foot or by donkey. The average population density is low, approximately 184 people per square kilometer, but that density is concentrated in strategic valley systems that control access routes between Pakistan and Afghanistan. This means that whoever controls these valleys controls the flow of people, goods, and arms between two countries. And right now, it is not the Pakistani state that controls them. According to reporting by Dawn newspaper and confirmed by multiple regional security sources, the Pakistani military has withdrawn from 47 forward operating bases in the tribal areas since January 2025. 47 bases. Lieutenant General Asim Salim Bajwa, former Director General of Inter-Services Public Relations, acknowledged in a 2024 briefing that, and I am quoting him directly here, maintaining forward positions in high-altitude tribal areas had become operationally unsustainable, given resource constraints and force protection requirements. That is military language for we cannot afford to keep our soldiers there, and we cannot protect them when we do. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing that the strategic picture in South Asia is completely different from what cable news is showing you. Now let's talk about what has filled the vacuum left by those 47 abandoned bases. Announcement number 1, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan has reconstituted operational command in 4 of the 7 tribal agencies. And this matters more than anything else happening in Pakistan's security landscape right now, because we are not talking about scattered militant cells. We are talking about a governing authority. The TTP, which was supposedly decimated by Pakistani military operations between 2014 and 2016, now administers Sharia courts in North Waziristan, South Waziristan, Kurram, and parts of Khyber Agency. These are not symbolic courts. According to testimony collected by the International Crisis Group in March 2026, these courts are adjudicating property disputes, marriage contracts, and criminal cases. Tribal elders are bringing cases to TTP judges rather than Pakistani civil courts because, as one elder from Maransha stated, the TTP judge is here, he understands our customs, and his ruling is enforced immediately. The Pakistani magistrate is 90 kilometers away in Banu, requires bribes, and his orders mean nothing when he leaves. Think carefully about what this represents. When a population chooses an Islamist militant court over the official state legal system, not because they are ideologically aligned with that militant group, but because that militant group provides more reliable justice, you are watching state collapse in real time. The TTP is providing what political scientists call governance goods. They are providing dispute resolution, they are providing security, they are providing predictability, and the Pakistani state is providing none of those things. According to data compiled by the Pakistan Institute for Peace Studies, the TTP conducted 312 documented attacks in 2025, resulting in 489 deaths. But that number, horrifying as it is, actually understates the problem because it only counts violent attacks. It does not count the daily administration of justice, the daily collection of taxes, the daily exercise of authority that happens without gunfire, without explosives, without anything that makes international news. The real metric is this. In areas where the TTP has reconstituted governance, Pakistani rupees are being replaced by the Afghani for daily transactions. Pakistani identity cards are being replaced by TTP-issued movement permits. Pakistani law is being replaced by the TTP's interpretation of Sharia. That is not insurgency. That is state replacement. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, and this is the part that almost no one in the international media is connecting. China has quietly suspended work on 11 separate China-Pakistan economic corridor projects that run through or near the tribal areas. 11 projects representing approximately $4. $2 billion in planned investment are now on indefinite hold. Beijing does not announce these suspensions publicly. There are no press releases. But field reports from the Express Tribune and regional business sources confirm that Chinese engineers have withdrawn from road construction projects in Kurram, from power infrastructure projects in North Waziristan, and from fiber optic installations that were meant to connect the tribal areas to the national grid. The official reason given is security reassessment. The real reason is that China has concluded that Pakistan cannot guarantee the safety of Chinese nationals in these areas, and more importantly, that Pakistan cannot guarantee that infrastructure built there will remain under Pakistani government control. Let me be very specific about what this means. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, is not a single road. It is a $62 billion network of highways, railways, pipelines, and energy projects meant to connect Western China to the Arabian Sea through Pakistan. The entire strategic value of CPEC depends on Pakistan being a stable, unified corridor. If the tribal areas become ungovernable, if they become a black hole where Pakistani authority does not extend, then the entire northern route of CPEC becomes unusable. Goods cannot be transported through areas where the state cannot protect them. Pipelines cannot be maintained through areas where armed groups control access. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the implications for regional power dynamics become impossible to ignore. China has spent 8 years and tens of billions of dollars betting on Pakistan as its gateway to the Indian Ocean. And now, China is quietly hedging that bet because the Pakistani state is losing its own territory. Bloomberg reported in February 2026 that Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held what was described as a very frank discussion with Pakistani officials about governance in the western provinces. Very frank, in diplomatic language, means Beijing delivered an ultimatum. According to Pakistani officials who spoke to Reuters on condition of anonymity, the message was clear: restore control over the tribal areas by the end of 2026, or China will redirect CPEC investments through alternative routes that bypass the tribal belt entirely. That alternative route goes through Balochistan, which has its own separatist insurgency, meaning China is choosing between one ungovernable region and another. Think about the implications for a moment. Pakistan's entire economic strategy depends on Chinese investment. The government in Islamabad is running a fiscal deficit of 6% of GDP. Foreign currency reserves are barely sufficient to cover 2 months of imports. Without Chinese loans and Chinese project financing, Pakistan faces imminent default. And China is now saying explicitly that continued investment is conditional on Pakistan controlling its own territory. Pakistan cannot meet that condition. The math is brutal and simple. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. The Afghan Taliban government has opened 3 official border crossing points in areas that the Pakistani state does not control. 3 crossing points established in the past 14 months that are administered jointly by the Afghan Taliban and local tribal militias with zero Pakistani government presence. These crossings, documented by Afghan and Pakistani journalists, are at Angor Ada in South Waziristan, Gulam Khan in North Waziristan, and Karlachi in Kurram. They are not informal smuggling routes. They are formal checkpoints where the Afghan Taliban issues crossing permits, collects customs duties, and regulates the flow of people and goods. And Pakistan has no presence there. Pakistani border guards are stationed 15 to 20 kilometers away from these crossings. They do not attempt to assert control because, as one Pakistani security official told the News International, any attempt to shut down those crossings would require a military operation, and we do not have the forces available for that operation. So you have Pakistani territory where Afghanistan is collecting customs revenue. You have Pakistani citizens crossing into Afghanistan through gates controlled by the Afghan Taliban and tribal militias, not by Pakistan. And you have goods flowing across what is legally an international border without any involvement from the Pakistani Customs Service. That is not a border dispute. That is a loss of sovereignty. The economic implications are staggering. Pakistan loses an estimated $120 million annually in customs revenue from these three crossings alone. But the strategic implications matter more. When Kabul can establish official border infrastructure on Pakistani territory and Islamabad cannot remove it, you are watching one state extend authority into the nominal territory of another state. And the reason Kabul can do this is because the tribes in those areas prefer Taliban administration to Pakistani administration. They have made a choice, and it is not Pakistan they have chosen. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the international media is only covering one of them. The story you are reading in Western newspapers is about terrorism, militants crossing from Afghanistan, bomb blasts in Peshawar, Pakistani military operations. That is a true story, but it is not the complete story. The complete story is about state failure. Pakistan's tribal areas are not being lost to a terrorist insurgency. They are being lost because the Pakistani state never successfully integrated them in the first place, and now it lacks the resources, the legitimacy, and the political will to do so. These areas were governed under colonial-era frontier crimes regulation until 2018, a legal framework that denied residents basic constitutional rights. Even after the 2018 merger with Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Islamabad allocated almost no development funding to these regions. Roads were not built. Schools were not established. Hospitals were not opened. The only Pakistani state presence was military checkpoints, and now even those are being abandoned. Pakistani Interior Minister Mohsin Naqvi responded in March 2026 by announcing a new tribal areas development package worth 85 billion rupees. 85 billion rupees over 5 years for an area of 5 million people. That works out to approximately 3,400 rupees per person per year, which is $12. $12 per person per year to win back regions that are currently governed by the Taliban. This has not notably changed the situation on the ground. Think carefully about what this represents. When Pakistan spends $12 per person per year on development in the tribal areas while spending billions on nuclear weapons and conventional military hardware, that is a statement of priorities. It tells the tribal populations exactly how much the state values them, and they are responding rationally to that message. If the state will not provide roads, schools, courts, or security, and a militant group will provide all of those things, then the choice is obvious. Indian analysts, particularly at the Observer Research Foundation, have noted this dynamic with barely concealed satisfaction. A March 2026 analysis by Brigadier Arun Sahgal, former Indian Army officer, stated that Pakistan's loss of the tribal areas represents the logical conclusion of decades of using jihadist proxies for strategic depth. You cannot control militants you have empowered. Eventually, they decide they do not need you anymore, and they take your territory. If you are watching this from Pakistan, what is happening in Waziristan is not a foreign policy story about Afghanistan. It is a story about whether the schools in your city will stay funded while Islamabad struggles with fiscal collapse. If you are watching from India, this is not an abstract geopolitical development. This is about what happens to a nuclear arsenal when the state that controls it begins to fragment. If you are watching from Washington or Brussels, this is not about counterterrorism metrics. This is about whether a state of 240 million people can hold together, or whether South Asia is about to experience a Yugoslavia-scale collapse. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. Let me give you the historical parallel that matters most here, because it is not ancient history. It is recent, it is documented, and the parallels are exact. Soviet Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan with the fourth largest military in the world. They had tanks, helicopter gunships, overwhelming firepower, and a willingness to use it without restraint. They fought for 10 years. They killed approximately 1 million Afghans, and they lost. Not because the Mujahideen had better weapons, but because the Mujahideen had better knowledge of the terrain, better support from the local population, and infinite patience. The Soviets could win every battle and still lose the war because they could not govern the territory after they won the battle. Pakistan in 2026 is facing the exact same dynamic in its own tribal areas. The Pakistani military can launch operations. They can clear valleys. They can kill militants. but they cannot govern afterward because governance requires resources, legitimacy, and commitment that Islamabad does not have. So the militants wait, the military withdraws, and control reverts. It is the same cycle the Soviets experienced, except Pakistan is experiencing it in its own sovereign territory. The Soviet Union lost Afghanistan and then collapsed 3 years later. The war did not cause the collapse, but it revealed underlying weaknesses that the Soviet system could not address: economic strain, loss of legitimacy, inability to deliver governance goods. Pakistan is showing all the same symptoms. The loss of the tribal areas is not the cause of Pakistan's crisis. It is the symptom that reveals how deep the crisis already is. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths, because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, Pakistan successfully reasserts control through a combination of military force and massive development investment. This would require Islamabad to commit at least 500 billion rupees over the next 5 years, deploy 50,000 additional troops to the tribal areas, and sustain operations against entrenched militant groups while simultaneously winning over a hostile population. It would require China to continue CPEC funding despite security concerns. It would require the Afghan Taliban to stop supporting the TTP. The probability of all of those conditions being met simultaneously is less than 10%. This is the optimistic scenario, and it is almost impossible. Path 2, Pakistan accepts de facto loss of the tribal areas and tries to contain the problem from spreading to other provinces. This would mean fortifying positions in settled areas of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, allowing the tribal belt to become a semi-autonomous region under Taliban governance, and hoping that China accepts a reduced CPEC footprint. This is politically unacceptable to the Pakistani military, which views territorial concessions as existential threats. But it may be the least bad option available. Probability 35%. Path 3, the loss of the tribal areas triggers wider fragmentation. Balochistan, which already has an active separatist movement, sees Pakistan's weakness in the tribal areas and escalates its own campaign. Sindhi nationalists begin making similar demands. The Pakistani state faces simultaneous insurgencies in multiple provinces while managing economic collapse. This is the nightmare scenario. This is what Indian strategic planners are quietly preparing for, and the probability is higher than anyone in Islamabad wants to admit. I would put it at 55%. I think we are closer to path 3 than the headlines suggest, because the underlying conditions, economic collapse, loss of state legitimacy, militant reconstitution, are all worsening simultaneously. Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves are declining. Chinese investment is stalling. The TTP is expanding governance structures. Every trend line is negative. But here's the caveat. States can survive for years, even decades, in managed decline. The Soviet Union existed for 3 years after losing Afghanistan. Pakistan may limp forward in a state of permanent crisis without fully collapsing. The question is not whether Pakistan faces state failure. The question is how fast it happens, and whether the international community is prepared for what comes after. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, if Pakistan loses effective control over its western provinces, what happens to its nuclear arsenal? Second, if China concludes that CPEC is not viable through Pakistan, does Beijing shift its entire South Asian strategy toward India, and what does that do to the regional balance of power? Third, if 5 million people in the tribal areas are now living under Taliban governance, how long before that model spreads to other ungoverned spaces in Pakistan, and what does that do to stability across South Asia? Tell me in the comments what you think happens next. Tell me if you think I am overestimating or underestimating the speed of Pakistan's decline. Tell me if you are seeing this story covered anywhere else in mainstream media, because you are not. We will keep tracking every development in Pakistan's tribal areas, in Balochistan, in CPEC projects, and in the broader question of whether Pakistan survives as a unified state. That is what this channel does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand South Asian geopolitics beyond the simplified narratives. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, because what happens in these mountains will determine the future of 240 million people, the fate of a nuclear arsenal, and the stability of an entire region. We will see you in the next analysis.